Hello everyone, Professor Philip Travis. This week in American history, we're going to look at a really critical turning point, not only for the United States in international relations and the U.S. and the world, but also for the United States in general in terms of society, economics, politics, and so on. And this relates to the Cold War, and it relates to a very significant turning point in the Cold War that occurs really in 1949 and 1950. If you're one of my students in my class, be sure to summarize the general gist of the major themes of this video in the extra credit discussion board. If you're just watching this on YouTube, please subscribe to my channel on YouTube, History Changes. So the Cold War, historians do debate a little bit when the Cold War began. Some scholars, like John Lewis Gaddis, would argue that the Cold War began really in 1945 with the end of the Second World War, and Gaddis would argue that this really brought the United States, the United States and the Soviet Union, these two ideological opponents together in conflict. He would argue that it was a more inevitable development that began with the end of World War II and the destruction of the old world powers, if you will, the old world European powers. Other scholars like Thomas Patterson would argue that the Cold War began in 1947, and the causes of the Cold War were driven by a large part by various decisions that were made by both Soviet leaders like Joseph Stalin as well as American leaders like Harry Truman, who you see pictured here. Some of those decisions, for example, Stalin's insistence effectively on occupying Eastern Europe, places like Poland, of course, East Germany, in other areas, which was viewed by the United States under Harry Truman as a unacceptable action that it could not accept in a normalized way. And of course, for the United States, it's holding on to the atomic weapons monopoly, which sort of escalated tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union and led to an arms race ultimately. Of course, typically, if you're looking at this from the Thomas Patterson perspective of the origins of the Cold War, the key moments that would be associated with the beginning of the Cold War, in word, they would start with statements made by Stalin as well as Winston Churchill in 1946. Churchill with his Iron Curtain speech, Stalin with his suggestion that the communist world needed to expand, or at least that's how the world took Stalin's statement in 1946. In terms of policy actions, really the development in 1947 and 1948 period of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, which really began the development of what historians call the containment policy. The Truman Doctrine, of course, involved particularly aid to Turkey and Greece to stabilize those governments as bulwarks against the potential spread of what was seen as communist influence in that area of the world, and very much the idea, the so-called domino theory that you heard so much about during the Vietnam War, was used to justify the Truman Doctrine. And then, of course, the Marshall Plan, which was that massive aid and spending program that the United States used to invest in countries across the world. And in exchange for that investment in countries not only like Great Britain, France, West Germany, but also places like Japan, for example, the investment of Marshall Aid funds was sort of done in exchange for a closer relationship, the building of alliances between the United States and the forces of communism. And of course, the United States had actually offered the Soviet Union Marshall Plan aid, but of course the Soviet Union really couldn't accept that, as that would have necessitated the arrival of American interest, economic interests, and all of the sort of strings that might be attached to those. And so the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan really formalized, in a policy sense, the development of the Cold War and the containment policy. And right in line with those developments were some key other world developments. Of course, the Berlin blockade and the Berlin airlift in 1948 really began to intensify the situation as Joseph Stalin, seeing Berlin as in East Germany, believes it should inherently be part of East Germany, blockades the city. But then, of course, flying the Allies, if you will, led by the United States, the British, and so forth, flew airdrops into Berlin, over into East Germany, dropping supplies to the East or the West Berliners, ultimately breaking the blockade in an event that many thought at the time might kick off World War III between the Soviet Union and the United States. The Cold War continues to escalate. And again, what made the Cold War so significant, hence the containment policy, was that it resulted in the development of a world that was really driven into a period of bipolarity in which major powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, created spheres of influence. And within the world, these spheres of influence, generally speaking, did not participate in normalized relations, whether it be economic trade, movement of people, even normalized diplomacy was pretty absent at that time as well. So it's a period of global bipolarity. It should be noted, of course, too, there was a third element to this that develops, the so-called non-aligned movement, which we'll talk a little bit more about when we get to the 1950s. And those were countries like Egypt, India, Yugoslavia, who kind of played both sides, didn't necessarily join either sphere of influence. So, as the Cold War develops, when we get to 1949, things really start to intensify. In 1949, of course, the Soviet Union detonated its own atomic bomb. And it did so through allegations of espionage. The Alger Hiss trial became a big news obsession in the United States. The trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenbergs, just a couple of the cases of allegations of espionage, particularly connected to the development, in the case of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, of a Soviet atomic bomb. In 1949, too, of course, China falls to the forces of the communist forces led by Mao Zedong. And herein lay the deep historical roots of the modern tensions and crisis between China and Taiwan. The ally of the United States historically in China was Shanghai Shek. And Shanghai Shek's forces, known as the Nationalists or the Kuomintang, they were defeated in 1949 by the forces of Mao Zedong, and they took refuge on the island of Taipei or Taiwan. And for decades after this, of course, the United States, until the late 1970s, mid-1970s, the United States actually recognized Taipei, the capital of Taiwan, as China, and the government in the capital of China. And to this day, of course, we know China regards Taiwan as part of China, and it has expressed its intent on making it part of China, again, literally. And of course, the United States and other powers in the world have asserted their support behind Taiwan, albeit doing so in a way in which they stop short of overtly saying that China or that Taiwan is an independent country because of the hostile tensions. Though the Taiwanese government today is now is no longer asserting that it is the government of China today. It's much more asserting that it's an independent government. But 1949, China falls to the forces of Mao Zedong. In 1950, the forces of North Korea, at the encouragement of Joseph Stalin, invade South Korea. Here you see American soldiers fighting in the Korean War. And here is Harry Truman in 1950 authorizing U.S. involvement in a United Nations action in South Korea. And the Korean War became an intense campaign, one in which the United States, the United Nations, its allies in South Korea were almost defeated before, of course, they were isolated in a very small corner of South Korea called the Pusan Perimeter, before, of course, General Douglas MacArthur had his swan song, launching the amphibious landing on Incheon, pushing the forces back to the border with China, the Yalu River. But then, of course, the forces of Communist China invaded from Manchuria, and that war would ultimately stalemate at the current border between North and South Korea. And that was a devastating war. Nearly 40,000 Americans lost their life in that war. What this means is that American policymakers looked at the situation and they said, wow, things in the Cold War have just gotten way more intense. One, the Soviets have their own atomic bomb. Two, it looks like now the expansion of communism was expanding beyond major areas of Europe. In the early period of the Cold War, containment policy was centered on the idea of strong points. It was centered on this idea that you had to contain Soviet communism in certain key strategic areas, like Berlin, like France, Italy, West Germany, but not everywhere. With the development of a Soviet atomic bomb, China falling to the forces of Maoist communism, and the development of the Korean War, the United States witnesses a fundamental retooling of its containment policy. And this was a really significant development. And in conjunction with this development, we're going to talk a little bit about this NSC 68, National Security Council Report 68, just for a moment here. But as all of this is happening, the United States, too, makes a really significant decision. It decides to develop what it called at the time the Super. And the Super was a reference to a hydrogen bomb, which the physicist Edward Teller would be pretty significant in its development. A hydrogen bomb is basically the first thermonuclear weapon. And the biggest ones were some 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. Well, the United States in 1949 said, now the Soviets have the atomic bomb, should they go ahead and start developing this hydrogen bomb, the Super, as they called it. This was a controversial discussion in Harry Truman's cabinet. And, of course, I'm sure you're aware, from just general understanding of history, that the United States does make this choice to develop this weapon. And tests of hydrogen bombs began in earnest in 1953. However, it was controversial, and in fact, believe it or not, the very sort of the individual usually credited with the development of the containment policy, George Kennan, famous for his Mr. X article, his article that suggested you had to contain communism, Soviet communism, in certain strong points, actually resigned his position in the Truman administration over the choice, largely, to develop the hydrogen bomb, because he saw this as taking the world down a path of a global nuclear arms race that would get more and more and more significant in terms of its potential to destroy humanity on a level never thought before. As all of this is developing, an individual named Paul Nitze in the National Security Council would develop something called NSC 68. And NSC 68, NSC, National Security Council. NSC 68, the National Security Council, is of course born with the Cold War, right? With the CIA, the Defense Department, the National Security Council is born. And this was one of the most landmark developments in the history of American foreign policy. The gist of NSC 68, which was accepted by the Truman administration in 1950, and becomes the basic apparatus of American containment policy moving forward, albeit different presidents, they do different things with how you should spend money. But the accepted idea now became that containment was no longer going to be about containing communism in certain key points. Instead, it was going to be about containing communism globally. It accepted the idea that basically wherever communism was expanding, that the United States had to contain it, basically with the assumption that an expansion of communism anywhere is more or less as significant as the expansion of communism in West Germany or France, basically. And this was a response largely to these developments, Mao, Korea, in Asia, and of course in the background you start to see the developments of what becomes the Vietnam War as well. So now with this expansion in Asia, the United States accepts this doctrine that basically it had to globalize containment policy. Now, I said at the beginning of this, and I'm almost done, why is this more than just a policy document? Well, here's why. If you seek to contain communism, globally, meaning that you have to be prepared to potentially, not only economically, but potentially fight wars of containment anywhere in the world at any time, that you had to be sort of prepared at all times. What that necessitated was very, very, very large defense budgets. And effectively, this is the beginning of the sort of, if you will, the United States as a preeminent global sort of military power. This is the beginning of huge defense budgets that, of course, we know in the modern 21st century, we know these remain very, very significant. Today in the 21st century, there's nearly 700 overseas military bases. This is where a lot of this stuff is really becoming sort of cemented in American policy and global influence in the world. Okay? So when you have to have a massive military budget to fight wars of containment, whether they be proxy wars, irregular sort of guerrilla wars, or maybe even conventional wars like you saw with the Korean War, that costs a lot of money. And what that means is you are now accepting as part of the American economy, and this had never been on this scale ever before in American history before the Second World War. You are accepting into the American economy that a fundamental part of the American economy is the war industries. It is making planes, it is making munitions, it is making things used in the defense industry. It is large-scale, largely permanent jobs for many, 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 many people within the military, within the military's administration, and of course within the various jobs that become associated with what becomes known as the military-industrial complex. And so this is where we see the emergence of this notion, this development in American society called the military-industrial complex. That's fundamental for the American economy. It's fundamental for American politics. And in a lot of ways, it's fundamental to American society and even culturally, I think you could say. So think about a couple of these. Economics. Well, now you have, as this really becomes firm and cemented in American society, now you have a myriad of types of good-paying jobs linked to the military-industrial complex. Maybe a person will work for Raytheon or Boeing or Lockheed Martin or any of the numerous types of industries that become associated with this. Well, now these good-paying jobs become part of the economy. Politicians want those jobs in their districts. If they get those jobs in their districts, the economy improves. People win elections. If you stand against it, you lose those jobs, you lose elections because it hurts the economy. In many cases, cities, towns across America, in many cases, either thrived or didn't on the basis of the military-industrial complex. The so-called Sun Belt of the United States, Southern California, Texas, Florida, places like this, increasingly began to thrive in the second half of the 20th century, in large part because they became hubs of things like the aerospace programs in the United States and other elements associated with the military-industrial complex. And this poses potential challenges for American democracy because now you have a very, very significant escalation of the involvement of the role of, or not necessarily direct role, right, but of the influence of the military and its various associate elements in the making, thinking, the policy making, and the decision making of American government, of American politics and society. All right, this was a really long one. I'll give you 3 points for this one. I'm sorry it was so long, but this is a really important development in American history and something that we're going to keep on talking about this week, and we'll be returning to this and thinking about this throughout the class and how this has sort of shaped American society moving forward. So, sorry it's so long. I hope it's not too long. I'll try to make these a little bit shorter. I get carried away sometimes. But let's have a great week. I'll see everyone in the discussion forum this week.